So we're very, very lucky and blessed that Rebbetzin Dina Schoolmaker is in from Eretz Yisrael. Rebbetzin Schoolmaker is a very beloved mechaneches. She is a teacher to hundreds and hundreds of women, both young and old. I go to her class every Monday morning, Baruch Hashem, on Zoom, and has such a beautiful way of teaching Torah in such an authentic, relatable way. So we're very, very lucky and blessed that Rebbetzin Schoolmaker is here, and it's really my honor. It's really my honor and my privilege to introduce you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is really an honor to be here. And when I heard the topic for this year, I was thinking about a story that happened many, many years ago to me. I was a young mechanachas in Mechala, very idealistic, not that much older than my Talmidos. And a certain girl who came, she was a very good girl, but she, as we expect for girls in Eretz Yisrael, she became very connected to Torah. She wanted to marry a very serious Ben Torah. And she really had, thought a lot about her values and what she's looking for. Her mother, her parents, were very powerful people in the community with used to being listened to, if you want to put it that way. And the mother developed a kesher with me. She had all kinds of ideas of things that we could do for the program that she would pay for, you can imagine. And after this girl left Eretz Yisrael and started Shidduchim, the mother used to call me to discuss her daughter's Shidduchim. After one of a few conversations like this, she calls me up one day and she says to me, look, I think you should sit down for this conversation because this one's not going to be so pleasant. My husband wants to get on the phone. So I'm this young mechanechas, and she's already warning me that this is not going to be a pleasant conversation. He gets on the phone, dripping with sarcasm. Hello, it is Shalom Aleichem. It is so nice to meet you. It's a really interesting thing when you give birth to a child and you're most nefesh for the child and you raise the child and you take care of the child and you think you know your children well. And you think that when it comes time for big decisions, the child should be listening to you. And then they go off and they have teachers in Eretz Yisrael, and all of a sudden, what the teacher who knows them for 10 months said was more important than I was already shaking. So he says to me, look, we have a problem on our hands. My daughter wants to marry a very serious Ben Torah, a Yarei Shamayim. And then he says to me, I don't think you know the price tag of the dresses in my daughter's closet. So here's what we're going to do. He says, if you could find a very serious Ben Torah and Yarei Shamayim who also can pay for those expensive dresses, then that will be wonderful. He says, because to just tell you to be straight, you got us into this mess, and now you'll get us out of it. And he hung up. I was shaking. I called my father, who was Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva that had Bachrim who, inspired, self-made in many ways. And that's how the Shidduch came to be. This girl is married for many years to a very serious Ben Torah, very serious Yarei Shamayim, who also knew how to provide for her. Many years later, as I'm preparing and thinking about our topic for this special event, I saw that conversation in a different light. I saw a very powerful man who was used to being heard and getting his way, who needed to work synergistically with me. He needed to work synergistically with, he needed me. He didn't know how to do it in a tactful way, and it was very aggressive. But basically what he was saying is, come, let's work together to marry off my daughter. And I have to thank you, ladies, because only now, maybe 25 years later, am I seeing that conversation in a different light. It was so assertive. It was so, whatever it was. But now I'm thinking, he could have said, don't you ever talk to my daughter ever again. He could have convinced the daughter not to, but he knew he needed to work with me. And all of a sudden I started thinking, sometimes people don't exactly know how to accept the fact that they have to work synergistically. And they come off aggressive and they come off controlling, but on some level they need us. And I think that this is what I was thinking about that really saw the whole thing in a different light. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this because these situations come up. And what do we do when we're facing somebody who really does not have the same amount of experience in chinuch as you have and really should be more respectful? But be'etzem, for the good of the child, they need you. Whether they realize it or not, they need you. And I'm really thinking about this now from this. We're going to see it in packaging that's very difficult. One of my favorite Chinuch Habanim books, it used to be only in Hebrew, Al Tichtu Bayeled by Rav Yechiel Yaakovson, now translated almost word for word, spare the child. And he basically says that every time you make a direct command from a child, you're running into two very basic human mitos, which are atzlus and meri. Atzlus, don't tell me what to do. Atzlus, do I have to get off the couch to listen to you? And meri, merida, don't tell me what to do. And if I'm not mistaken, I think he quotes Chazal in Sanhedrin, where Chazal talk about the very interesting machlokas between Antoninos and Antoninos and, trying to remember, and Rebbe, about when the Yetzer Hara comes into a person at the moment of conception or the moment of birth. And the very interesting conclusion of the Gemara is that a baby does not have a Yetzer Hara till the moment of birth. How do we know? Because if the baby would have a Yetzer Hara at the moment of conception, the baby would never agree to be confined to the womb for 9 months. Nobody tells me what to do. He'd push himself out and abort the pregnancy. And the fact that pregnancies are carried to term is a sign that the Yetzer Hara doesn't come until birth. And you see it. You take a newborn baby and you try to feed them. If they don't want to eat, they will not eat. You swaddle them. If they don't want to be swaddled, they're kicking the blanket off. They're only alive for a few hours. They're already telling you, don't tell me what to do. And sometimes we are dealing with an adult version of Mary. Don't tell me what to do. And just the authority itself, just the fact that you have the authority, already puts them in a position that's very difficult for them. And I realize that some people who have this, it's not that they want to be difficult. Sometimes they might want to be difficult. And sometimes they're just out of their elements when they have to be machniah to something bigger than them. I have a very, very lovely young boy, my son, who is a wonderful, wonderful child. And he's not a tough, aggressive child at all. But I learned this message once when he was probably around maybe 2 or 3 years old. I was making him a sandwich, and I poured him a cup of juice. And I gave him the juice, and I kind of turned around to make the sandwich, and I said to him, "Are you drinking your juice?" I turned around, and I saw something that Mama taught me about a tone of the child. He was about to drink the juice, and then he heard me say, "Are you drinking the juice?" He put it down, and he says to me, "Chaval shebikasht." I wanted to drink, but now that you asked me to, I have to assert my independence. Chaval, we're Israeli. Chaval shebikash. Chaval that you asked me to drink it, because I was going to drink it until you asked me. So now I'm going to be thirsty. And it's just so interesting how to the mouth of a child, what he was showing me how hard it is for him to be machniah. Now, I'm sure I'm not being machadish to you. You deal with this all day and all night. But I'd like to turn it around. And I'd like to deal with it from the level of the hashgacha, of what's in it for me. If I'm dealing with a parent who isn't so easy to deal with, why was Rebbe Shalom megalgal a situation like this towards me? And why so many of these situations? So I'll share with you another very interesting interaction that I had with a child of mine. And we're going to go into a whole method. I have a very, very wonderful yeshiva bacher, mamish, I would call him a tzaddik of a child. He learns very late, and he goes to later minyanim. And we have this conversation about, what's the ideal time to go to minyan or not. We've had this conversation many times. He turns to me recently, and he says to me, I said, I was trying to be respectful. I said, I want to understand your friends and the boys who learn late. What's What are you thinking? He says, Mommy, I don't even have koch to tell you the reason, because I know that I will never affect the way you think about this. He says, you love me very much. You would do anything for me. But I know that to get you to change the way you think about something, I don't even have the koch to even try. And it was said very respectfully, but it made me reevaluate myself. I said, I consider myself a flexible person. I drive my kids everywhere. I do everything they want. I turn around like a pretzel to accommodate their schedules. But there's a difference between cognitive flexibility and situational flexibility. And when I brought this up with my vadim, I teach women in Yerushalayim, many, many women say that they are very flexible with their husband's schedules, with accommodating his learning, with the Mesiras Nefesh of a woman for a family. But when it comes to a different attitude towards how to spend money or something like that, people find themselves to be very rigid. So I decided after this comment that really hit me, I said, I want to develop one of my Musavatim topics on this topic. I started doing the research. And Chazal and Shabbos Chaf Gimel talk about machlokas beis Hillel beis Shammai. We know that when there's a machlokas between Hillel and Shammai, we pass like beis Hillel. And Chazal explained why. Why do we pass like beis Hillel? Because we know that be'etzem elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim. So why do we pass like beis Hillel? Because Hillel had the mitos of being nochin va'aluvin. Nochin va'aluvin, to the light of the research I did on this topic. Noach means flexible, aluv, we know, with your head down. Nochin va'aluvin means cognitively flexible. And aluvin is the willingness to be in a subjugated position. And I've been teaching this, and I cannot tell you how many women tell me that this is maybe the hardest. I've been teaching mitos for 15 years. Some of them tell me this is the hardest midah for them. To flexible, to go for fleishiks when you want fleish, fine. To see the world through your glasses, to be able to understand you, very, very, very difficult. And I think I know why. We could talk a little bit about why. But I wanted to just go a little bit into this Nochin Va'aluvin, because I did this for maybe 3 or 4 weeks in my Vadim. So Nochin, we're not trying to say that the reason why Paskin like Beis Hillel is because they had better midos than Shammai. Shammai also had very, very important midos. But rather that for the context of Paskining, the midah of Hillel is more conducive to a more robust opinion. Let's understand. Chazal explain, how were they nochin va'aluvin? How do we know that? And Chazal Mamish give 2 practical tips that I've been trying, and I'm sweating as I'm using them. Hayushonim divrehim v'divrei Beis Shammai, that they were able to articulate equally their opinion and the opposite opinion that they didn't agree with. Now, when I tell over to my husband something at the end of the day about some conversation I had with somebody, so my position is very articulate with all the proofs. And yeah, they think that, whatever. The vaccination thing doesn't happen to be my topic. But, I'll give all the proofs. They think that anybody who vaccinates is going to die. We tend to not be able to actually be well-versed and articulate in the other person's opinion. So this is the meat of Hillel, that even when they did not agree with Shammai, they were still well-versed in the opinions of Shammai and were able to articulate it respectfully. I'm finding that to be very difficult. And imagining in the context of a parent who you are not agreeing with. I have my 3-word version of what their parents' opinion, they're entitled, they're spoiled, they're closed-minded, they're whatever. Or Lemaisa, where they're coming from. And Chazal are giving us a gift of a tip that cognitive flexibility doesn't just happen. It needs to be practiced. And I'm telling you, sometimes it's even hard for me to present another person's side respectfully when I don't agree with it. But this is what Chazal is saying in Zamida Beis Hillel. You shonim divreim v'divrei Shammai. And then Chazal go on to say that Beis Hillel did one more thing. V'hayu makdimim divrei Beis Shammai l'divreihem. Which means that they would not fully articulate their own opinion until they really, really heard and were able to say over the other opinion. Now, there's a very interesting way of looking at this. First of all, I want to just go back and say, it really helps us understand. We paskin like Beis Hillel because you knew that Hillel's opinion incorporated Shammai's opinion. Even when Hillel totally disagreed with Shammai and didn't paskin like them, you knew that the havamina of what Shammai thought was already taken into consideration. That's why we paskin like Beis Hillel, not because they had better midos, but because you were hearing a more robust, you knew that whatever the conclusion of Beis Hillel was, it took into consideration Beis Shammai, and most of the time didn't agree, but it was all taken into consideration. So you weren't hearing Beis Hillel's opinion from Hillel. You were hearing Hillel plus Shammai when you heard Hillel. And this is a very, very important skill to be able to use. Very hard, but possible. Possible to practice. I could take questions if you want. Would you like to ask something? Okay. So first of all, I think that we're talking about shonim different. We're not even talking about necessarily articulating to the parents. We're talking that when I'm sitting later on my own, instead of saying, yeah, they want the child not to have to take the test, and I think the child needs to take the test because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, in my own mind, what are their considerations that they are thinking of? And therefore, if myself, I come back to the conclusion that I'm right, I'm more cognitively flexible. Because maybe it's a little more than they don't want the child to ever have to struggle. Maybe there's something going on with the child. Maybe it has something to do with their own attitude towards the way they see tests. Maybe there's anxiety with one of the parents. Maybe the parents are perfectionists and need the child to get 100 on every test. The idea is I'm delving into understanding them without flipping them off. Now, when you say, does someone want to ask something here? Please feel free to. Anybody can. Okay, you can. What's that? In the vast majority, somebody in one of my classes, it's considering. In one of my classes, my student said to me, how often were Hillel actually machnia to Beis Shammai? And my answer was, I don't know. Somebody checked it through AI. I don't touch AI, so I don't know if that's, I don't know. And they said 14 times in Shas. In my mind, it could be 14,000, it could be 0, I don't know. But the point is that the vast majority of cases in Tanakh, Hillel paskined his way. There are few situations we paskin like Beis Shammai, very few that I know of. And like I said, it was an interesting question, and I didn't have the answer. Somebody else had some answers that I don't think was accurate. Exactly. So I want to say it like this. There's two pieces to this stretch, to this exercise. One is Nochin, and the other is Aluvin. Nochin is just the cognitive flexibility to be able to try to understand what is going on with you, where they're coming from. Aluvin is if they happen to be right, I'll put my head down. And it could be that in the vast majority of the cases, it wasn't like that with Beis Hillel. And that's why I'm saying this to you. Because I'm not saying let's turn the whole educational system upside down and let's let the parents run the show in every area. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that for me, if Hashem, if the Baruch Hashem is megalgal a situation where I'm dealing with people whose opinions are so vastly opposite mine, so this is an opportunity for me to work on my own cognitive flexibility, even if I come to 100% the same maskana. But I'm not coming from it from that kind of a position. I took the time. I think that there's another factor here. And everything that I'm saying now is really ben adam la'atzmo. It's me being a person who can try to be flexible enough to understand a different way. But I think that on the ben adam l'chaveru level, there may be, I have a woman in one of my classes in Shalim. She's a neuropsychologist. She's a big tzaddikas. And she says to me, this also creates the mirror neurons for them seeing your way. Meaning this is not just for you to be a person who can, meaning you're mirroring to them the openness. Now, I don't know anything about mirror neurons, so I'm not the neurologist, right? But I would say psychologically, when somebody feels you hear them, the whole dialogue can change. And some people just need to be heard more than anything else is that they need to be heard. I find very, very, very often that when you have a synergistic conversation and you align yourself, it's not you versus the parent. It's you and the parent versus the problem. So you are on the same side of the table. And by the way, this is a key that I use all the time in Shalom Bayis. There is a writer by the name of Susan Heitler. She happens to be Jewish. Her writings are not particularly Jewish, but she has a book called From Conflict to Resolution. And she gives fantastic, I heard her actually speak in Yerushalayim once to a group from mechanchim and therapists. And she said one of the biggest issues in relationships, whether it's Shalom Bayis or you and a child or you and parents, is that it creates me versus you. It's really supposed to be me and you versus the problem. And it's not always going to work. But really, if you think about my opening story with that very tough father, it's what he was trying to do. He didn't have the language to do it, but he was basically saying, let's solve this problem together and find a shidduch for my daughter. And it was actually very smart, because as much as I was shaking from him, I also felt that we had to work on this together. So there was something about it that the energies just became, we're solving a problem. That's because I was all of 24 years old. Yes. And I started by saying, but I'll tell you why I use that story anyway. Most people who speak to us, who rub us the wrong way, didn't go to communication workshops about the sandwich method, where they walk in and tell you how you're such a wonderful menaheles, and then give you a very thin slice of what they would like to change, and then they end up on the... Most people don't. And I want to tell you something about this, that I'm doing this. I want to add a different, hold on to this point, because I want to add something to it in a minute. Okay. But I do realize that myself, by the way, I ended up being very close to this family. They're very beloved people in my life, and that story has gone down to the generations, and we all laugh about it all the time. But people's bedside manner are often terrible. And the ones who are bothering you, they have terrible bedside manner. But just because they have bedside manner doesn't mean that you want to work on Nochen V'Aluvin. Because it's good for you, and it's probably in the long run good for the situation. Now, when I did the research as to why Beis Hillel were shown him the words of Beis Shammai before, Hayu Makdimim Divrei Beis Shammai LeDivreihem. The real reason, the Sifsei Chaim says, is because they wanted to not be Nogea B'Davar. They wanted to be so clean and so not with an agenda that once I say to you, no, I'm not going to allow this, it's already much harder for me to back off of my position. So they would say, first, let's hear what you have to say, and they wouldn't actually formulate their opinion until afterwards. is the yashrus of Beis Hillel is that they wouldn't even articulate an opinion until they heard the other side. I will say that I think that in our communication, we have to ask ourselves, sometimes by coming in and saying, this is the way it's going to be. You have brought up the koach merida on the other side. And sometimes by saying, let me hear what you have to say, you are kind of creating more flexibility on both ends. And by the way, this is not a one-size-fits-all method. Absolutely not. Some people, the second you say, let me hear what you have to say, they already think that you're going to go their way. They're going to be upset at you later that you didn't go their way. So there's no one size here. But there's something about the openness to hearing the other side that does create more synergy in a conversation. Because the koach hamerida, I'm finding more and more, there's actually a new psychological definition for a new, we talk about oppositional defiant disorder, ODD. ODD has a violent piece of it. It's usually kids who also have a very destructive part. There's a new type of like a wing of an anti-authority child who cannot deal with authority, but they're not violent. It's just the second you say to them, let's do this, they'll say, let's not. We see it in children, and we see it in adults also. And I want to tell you a chiddush, and this to me was a very big chiddush, is that the anti-authority piece with these kinds of people, or that they even are misnagid to their own authority. They'll say, from now on, I'm going to sleep at 10 o'clock every night. They'll set it up, and then suddenly they're not going to keep to it because they don't like to be meshuvah to their own authority even. There's something about being mitzumtzum, being mechoyev to something, that even if they're mechayev themselves, it's problematic. So the world is moving more and more in this direction. Yes. Yes. Done. Yeah. Totally. This generation, completely. It's very, very, very strong in this generation. And I find with these kind of people, they have to pin their ratzon against their own ratzon. When they decide that it's worth it to do this and give up on that, they'll do it. If not, you could promise them a trip to Europe. It's not going to help. But if they decide they want to do it, they'll do it with no incentive. Meaning incentives don't work for these kind of kids, punishments don't work for these kind of kids. The need to not be controlled is so strong. In Mamish, I want to say that this is not just this generation. We say it's this generation. Really, this started as a result of Chet Adam Rishon. We all talk about, when we talk about, the outcome of Chet Adam Rishon, and we always talk about what's the ownership of Chava, Be'etzev Tilidi Banim. What we don't talk about so much is the pasuk in Bereshis Gimel Tes Zayin. It's because it often relates to Ishos, and we don't talk about it so much, but, Elishech Chukatzech V'hu Yimshol Bach. The Ibn Ezra doesn't take it in the way of Ishas. He takes it in the way that a woman's always running after something in a relationship. She always wants more. I wish he gave more Divrei Torah. I wish he would be nicer to his grandmother. I wish, and men are less like that. V'hu Yimshol Bach, the end of the pasuk. The Gemara in Beit Salamed Beis says that after the Chet Adam Rishon, it became the nature of human beings to not want to be told what to do. Much more found in men than in women, but there's a lot of male dominant traits in women as well. So he listened to Chava in Gan Eden, and it didn't really work so well. So now as a result, he's resistant to being controlled because it didn't work out well. I share with my students, the Gemara in Beitza says, Gimel Chayim Einam Chayim. And one of them is Zu Shishto Moshel Salav. Chayehim Einam Chayim. Rav Tzadok says that their chai ruchnius is limited, that they can't grow. So I'm taking this now to our interactions with parents who are adult children, and sometimes just the fact that somebody has Mars over them is enough to make it very, very hard to work with them. So therefore, when you come in with Nochen Va'aluvin, you're not just helping to be a cognitively flexible person, which will help you in your own marriage and your own parenting, but it's actually creating a situation where when people feel they have inputs, they also deal better. So this is what Chazal are, this is thousands of years ago, this is what Chazal were telling us, is that we paskin in Shas like Beis Hillel because they had these mitos, because they were able. Okay. How much time do I have? I don't want to go over. Let's go on? Yeah. Okay. I want to say that there's another piece here. I just did this with my students, with my Mechala students, that we're learning the midah of tznius. Tznius is like a hot potato that most of the seminaries have Yimeyon on tznius like halfway through the year when the girls can really hear it. But we talk a lot about tznius, about the two psukim in the Torah that talk about tznius and what they mean. And both of them, I think, have to do with these situations. And they're both hard. Lamaisa, we all know that tznius only appears twice in the Torah, in Micha and in Mishlei. And in both cases, it's not the classic tznius that we talk about, in terms of dress. The pasuk in Micha says, Hatzneah lechas elokecha is one of the three things that Hashem is asking of you. The Gemara Makos Chav Daled says that it's a tzimtzum of the whole Torah into three categories. Asas mishpat, avas chesed, vatzneah lechas elokecha. Because Moshe Rabbeinu got all 613, and people needed categories, and we have Yeshayahu, David, Micha, and Chavakuk, and tznius is a third of the whole Torah. So if anybody's seen, there's a very beautiful mahalach in the Sifsei Chaim, Rav Chaim Friedlander, on this. He says, what's tznius? Tznius means lahatzniah, means to cover something. Clearly, covering of your body is not a third of the whole Torah. So he says that tznius is really covering your ego. That's the umbrella concept. Within that concept, of course, the way I show my body is going to also be an ego thing. But Lamais, it affects all the way we're Mekayim everything, is how much is my ego getting into the picture. So I must say, and I'm not talking for anybody here, I'm talking for myself. When I have a hard time with somebody who I think should be machnia to me, and they have less experience in chinuch, and they're much younger, and they're coming with very strong opinions, and they really think that you're going to do it their way, there's a very big ego piece that comes here, and my tznius is the family of the midos, Hillel's midah of Anava and Nochen Va'aluvin goes together with the family of tznius. I'm covering my ego and making sure that my attitude towards these parents is not coming from the fact that I'm rubbed the wrong way by their entitlement, by their chutzpah, by the fact that they think that they're going to push me around, by the fact that I think that they don't know anything about parenting, they think that they do. But I have to really cover my ego in order to really, really get that message across in a way that's going to go over. If it's affecting me, if I'm rubbed the wrong way, which is why I opened up with that story. And that's what I wanted to get back to. If the person would have been very tactful, it would not have been I would not have used it for this event. The point is, it was a chutzpah. The whole tone was cynical and not nice. And that's when it's very, very hard to cover your ego and be able to figure out the right thing to do, because the person's really, they're challenging you. And it's very, very hard. But really what I wanted to get to, and maybe I'll wind down after this, is that the second place in the Torah where it says tznius is pasuk in Mishlei Yud Aleph, es tznuim chachma. Es tznuim chachma. That tznius and chachma come together. That's what the pasuk says. Rabbeinu Yonah on that pasuk, I think it's unbelievable. Rabbeinu Yonah in Mishlei Yud Aleph, es tznuim chachma. Rabbeinu Yonah says, he midas ha-chachamim. Tznius is the meat of chachamim. And look at how he defines tznius. Sheyishma'u v'yakshivu. They listen and they hear well. V'lo yitavu. Yitavu lashon taiva. Yud taf aleph vavav. Lo yitavu lehitgalut libam. They do not crave, technically it means exposure of their own heart. The way I translate it, they don't crave self-expression. Fascinating. Rabbeinu Yonah is saying, we talk about taiva for chocolate, for alcohol, for all kinds of things. He says there's a taiva for self-expression. I wanted to tell you what I think. And by the way, a lot of these parents are coming with that taiva to tell you their opinions. But he says the midah of tznius is the ability to not crave self-expression. I was just doing this with my students, and they were sweating over this. Because I say to them, what does it mean? What does tznius have to do with chachma, have to do with taiva? What is this? So I always give them an example. When a seminary girl goes to a Shabbos table, there's two types of seminary girls at a Shabbos table. What I call the polates or the poletas and the colate, like from the Hilchos Kashrus. In Kashrus, when we say the polate, it gives off the flavor of the pot to the meat. So some people come to a Shabbos table and they're very entertaining. They're talking about all their chavayot and their seminary and what they learned and what they're doing. And it's great to have a guest like this. The mother can go make a salad. The kids are all entertained. And then you have the koletas, the girl who sits there quietly. She's not sharing all of her stories. But she's using this opportunity to learn about Shalom Bayis. She's watching the parents interact. She learns about Chinuch Habanim. She learns about life in Eretz Yisrael. Because she's taking in. And by the way, these aren't always the funnest guests to have. You feel like you're on display when you have such a guest at your Shabbos table. But I say to my students, from these two girls, who comes out of the Shabbos smarter? For sure, the Koletas, because she wasn't so busy recycling her own chavayot. She was watching and learning new information. And Rebbeinu Yonah says that's what the pasuk in Mishlei means, v'esrum chachma. People who don't need to dominate are taking in information, and they become smarter. And we're not saying that the people who are vivacious and like to share. In fact, one time I gave this over in a seminary, and one of the head mechanchos came over and said to me, "Oh, what are we going to do? All of us who teach Torah all day, we're all recycling our own ideas all the time. We're not exactly sitting quietly so often. But this is the midah of chachamim, yishmu v'yakshivu." And then I say to myself, this is my chance. When somebody has an opinion that's different than mine, it's rubbing me the wrong way. First, the tznius of Micha, covering the ego. Then the tznius of Mishlei. Yishmu v'yakshivu. Let me figure out why parents in this generation think this way. And I think I know, but sometimes there are nuances. And even if I vehemently will continue to disagree, I became smarter. Sometimes people, you want to know how they even get to their opinions, because it will help you deal with the parent body in the future if you understand the nuances of how they come to these things. So the midah of chachamim is tznius, and not having that taiva for self-expression. And here I want to get to the bad bedside manner of parents for a minute. When I say to my students this idea, we'll wind down with this. I say there's different situations where you see the tznius of the different types of people dominating conversations, not dominating. I say, first of all, in the Western world, there's this big avodah zarah called self-expression. Of course, everybody's entitled to self-expression. But if you've sat at a bar mitzvah where somebody dominated the entire conversation and everybody wanted to go home and they didn't stop talking, that was like self-expression that came in the form of taiva. Because I could think carefully and say, I think I want to share an opinion that people will appreciate, then it's not taiva. It's like food. You could eat food out of taiva. You could smell something or see something and want it. Or you can make a conscious decision, this is what I want to eat now. Same thing with self-expression. I could choose that I have something meaningful to say, or I could crave self-expression so much that I'm not even paying attention to whether it's good or not, or whether anybody's interested or not. So we've all been at bar mitzvahs where conversations were dominated by somebody who was talking out of taiva. I said, but then there's a level that's more prevalent, which is when it's a topic which is very intense. And if it's something that we feel strongly about or the parent feels strongly about, they will often talk out of taiva. And there's so much anxiety today in today's world that maybe it's not the kind of person who would dominate a conversation, but they come into your office and they repeat themselves 50 times and they said it already and you heard it already and you have a headache from them. But it's hard for them to control the taiva to express themselves because it's sitting on an emotional reality. That's what taiva is. Taiva is an emotional impulse. It's not I should eat this chocolate now, it's I want to eat this chocolate now. So I want to get my child out of this mess. I want to. They're coming to you in a very charged place, and that's why they dominate, and that's why they sometimes do things that are inappropriate. But then we have the third type of conversation, and this is the hardest. It's the taiva for self-expression when somebody is criticizing you. The hardest of all of them. Somebody is calling you out on something, and you have a desperate need to defend yourself. And that, I think, there might be people among us who've never dominated a conversation at a bar mitzvah, but when somebody criticizes us, we can't control. And then it goes back to the pasuk of Mishlei. V'esnum chachma. The most important chachma in the world is my self-knowledge. And if somebody is calling me out on something and is criticizing me, and I just go right back defensively and tell them that I'm fine and I didn't do it, so I'm robbing myself of the chachma of understanding myself better. Rav Ori Weisblum, who is a mashgiach in Nachas in Haifa, Talmud of Rav Wolbe, he says about this concept. He says nobody likes criticism. Chazal in Erchen say that Rav Yochanan ben Nuri said, Kimdumani, that in this door there's nobody who accepts criticism in his door. And Rabbi Tarfon says back, Harbe pamim laka akiva al yadi, vosif biava. Oh, there's one person who likes to get criticism. His name is Rabbi Akiva. So if we don't like to be criticized, and the parents don't like to be criticized, we're in good company. Most people don't. Rabbi Akiva, at the time, in that times, Rabbi Akiva was the exception. He says, Elama, and I love this mashal. He says, if you go to a doctor, and the doctor has a terrible bedside manner, and he kept you waiting for half an hour, and he was sarcastic, and he was condescending. But if he gave you a prescription, you wouldn't throw the prescription away, because it's about your health. He says, people in life have prescriptions for us, and they exaggerate, and they're not nice. But sometimes if there's a kernel of truth in what they're saying, then I don't want to throw away that prescription because it's about my health. And I think that this is for two sides. I would want the parents to know that they are not understanding their child better by always being so defensive. But I'm not understanding my techniques as a mechaneches better if I can't hear what the parent is saying. Meaning, maybe they're 100% wrong, but is every parent always 100% wrong? Sometimes it's very hard to hear because the bedside manner is terrible, but maybe there is some kernel, is there something that I have to understand about this generation, or even about how to deal with this particular child that I wouldn't know unless I listened with tznius. And it's a very, very hard thing to do. Rav Weisblum is not talking to people in chinuch, he's talking to individuals. And he says, sometimes somebody gives you mussar about something, and it's very hard to hear. And he says, but really, you're holding a kos. You're trying to fill your life with bracha. And you keep trying to fill your kos. When there's an obvious crack in your cup, you would realize it. But if there's a tiny hole on the other side of the cup and you don't realize it, you're not able to fill your cup properly. And somebody comes and points out something, and what they're really doing is they're putting crazy glue in that little hole so that your kos shel bracha can become fuller. And I think it's true in our homes. It's true in our friendships. And it's also true in our schools, that no school is perfect. And sometimes a parent who has a very bad bedside manner is pointing out a little tiny hole, something that I wouldn't notice. And I could discard 98% of what they say. But the fact that I'm able to hear it, v'esnuam chachma, I'm able to hear it. So I think, and I'll end with this, that we all have people in our lives who we wish we could tell them things that would improve the quality of their life, and we can't approach them. And we don't want to be one of those people. So to be the kind of person who could hear it, even when it's hard to hear, creates a culture of I'm open to change. And according to my mirror neuron friend, they'll be open to change too. I had a woman, and you would probably like this kind of story. It's more nogea to you than to me. I tell people, if it's really hard for you to hear Musar, and you want to get really brownie points in Shemayim, how over time am I? Am I over? Finishing? Okay, good. I said, how many of us cannot approach loved ones who won't hear from us? We have such important things to tell them, and they won't listen. So I said to my students, if somebody's giving you Musar, it's so hard to hear. But if you can cover the ego, and if you could vest some chachma and bring in the chachma, I say you can even do a little extra credit. Which is at the end of the conversation to say to the person, I'm sure it's not easy to bring up these uncomfortable topics. And do you have anything else that you'd like to add once you're talking already? I had a mother who was sitting in my class, and she came over to me afterwards. She said, do you always make your students sweat and work so hard? I want to tell you a PS to this that you will appreciate, if those of you who deal with grade school. A woman in my class in Rehavia comes back to me a week later, and she said, when you said that, I was rolling my eyes. I was saying I would never be able to do that. She said, and then I got the phone call that no mother wants to get. The phone call you get from another mother in your child's class saying that your child has been bullying her child. I said, nobody wants to get that phone call. She said, before I would have learned this idea, I would have right away said, no, you must be making a mistake. Your daughter must be the problem. My daughter has good midos. She said, you know what? I just learned this thing. I wanna work on my tznius. So I covered my mouth, and I let the lady talk, and it was very hard. And I wasn't defensive. I just listened. At a certain point, she thanked me, and then I did the extra credits. She said, I'm sure it wasn't easy for you to make this phone call. And is there anything else that maybe you would like to add? The woman was quiet, and she said, actually, I do have one or two more examples. I didn't want to overwhelm you, so I didn't say them. And she said the next example she brought took the whole thing, and it clicked, and it made sense. She said, I couldn't figure out, why is my daughter doing these things? She said the example that came after was that sometimes my daughter's hair is messy, and your daughter makes fun of it. The woman, I give her credit, she said in front of 20 women around the table in Nevada, she said, I finally understood. She said, I'm a very big perfectionist. I run after my children if their hair is not perfectly in place. And I terrorize my children to always be tucked in and whatever. She said, Kanera, I transmitted perfectionism to my child who cannot handle seeing somebody else whose hair is messy. She said, I realize now my kid's a good kid. My perfectionism created the bullying. And she said, I never would have known that unless I would have asked for the extra. So, ve'es chachma. What chachma do we want in the world? To understand ourselves better, to understand our loved ones, our homes, our schools. So you could disagree a lot with a lot, but sometimes what comes out is like this aha moment where you understand something very important. Okay, that's it for today, ladies. Thank you.